In this episode, we shall try to understand what time really is. Definition of time. Relativity fails to understand what time actually is. Deriving exuberant equations based on fundamental errors of judgment may be regarded at best as an intellectual sport or a mathematical bumblejoy. Let's take one step back and try to disambiguate some fundamental concepts. Let's begin with one quote from Niels Bohr. It's wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out what nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature. We do not know why things exist and why things move. We do not know what we are. We do not know what conscience is and how it works. And we do not like to admit it. The best we can do is try to build a decently working virtual model of the natural world that we live in. A reasonably close approximation. We live inside the model of the world created in our minds. Therefore, it is dangerously easy for us to confuse and mix up our virtual images of the world with what these images actually try to reflect, the physical reality of nature. We need to disambiguate between our mental constructions, virtual objects that live only in the virtual space of our minds, and the real physical objects that actually live in the real space of nature. When one fails to do that, one ends up expecting the people on the TV screen to walk into the room and move the furniture. And that's precisely how relativity uses time. Because the speed of light is assumed to be invariant, something else has to be squeezed and stretched in order to fix the equations. Time and distances are simply the collateral victims of this practical joke. On his On the electrodynamics of moving bodies, better known as special relativity, Einstein says, it might appear possible to overcome all the difficulties attending the definition of the time by substituting the position of the small hand of my watch for time. And in fact, such a definition is satisfactory when we are concerned with defining a time exclusively for the place where the watch is located. I end the quote here because it's precisely the kind of time that I'm talking about. Despite of the wisdom of this expedient, we can in fact use it as it contains an important clue. All we can perceive and measure about time is the distance traveled by the hands of a watch. One cannot possibly produce a mental image of time itself, while one can easily produce a mental representation, memory, of volume, length, sound, temperature, touch, smell, taste, motion, of some thing. This is because the latter are images formed as the result of our interaction with real things. The only conscious representation one can produce about time is a diffuse emotional impression. Neither can our technical sensor devices detect the presumed real physical entity, object that we call time as it is. Time itself doesn't physically interact with anything. Indeed, this should be enough warning signals that time doesn't behave like any other physical entity. I say that this is because time, as we know, measure and use, is nothing more else but a calculation performed by our mind, brain. We need to plan our activities according to the succession of events that happen in the real world. We need to adapt to the cycles of nature, to the cycles performed by the Earth. We calculate the ratio between one cycle of the Earth and one cycle of our activity, and we call the result of this calculation time. We calculate the ratio between two speeds and then that we can indeed perceive. We find this ratio by comparing the distances traveled simultaneously by two moving objects. This includes the distances traveled by the hands of our clocks. Or count the number of oscillations, cycles, performed by atoms or crystals. We do not really measure the motion itself, but only its effect as traveled distances. The clock doesn't actually measure time. The clock simply turns with a constant speed, hopefully, and displays the distance traveled at that speed. It's the human user that reads the distance and gives it a meaningful significance, correspondence with time, by counting how many cycles the Earth performs simultaneously and calculate the ratio between these two. What we observe is not time, but simultaneity of events. We see what distance does the hand of the clock travel, and we see, no, the perceivable changes produced by the cyclic motion of the Earth. Daylight. Time is nothing but the calculated ratio between two traveled distances, and it acts as a real operator only upon our minds. Because it is the result of a ratio between two distances or two numbers of cycles, time is in fact dimensionless. It is useful for us to call one cycle of the Earth one day and to divide that cycle in hours, or to multiply it such as to match the other cycle of the Earth around the Sun that we call 1 year. Nature itself doesn't count the number of cycles. Nature simply moves things. Nature operates with volumes and energy. Nature doesn't operate with our image of it, hence time. Nature couldn't care less if we measure it or not, yet alone about the products of our calculations. As it is, our time calculation can only be changed by modifying the physical speeds, but in no way can the result of our calculation modify the physical speeds. It is indeed mind-blowing. How could anyone mess up elementary logic so ridiculously? It's okay for a toddler to confuse cartoon characters with real people and to pretend that he plays football with Donald. Yet it's slightly peculiar if one maintains this level of wisdom above a certain age. We all want Santa Claus to be real, but one day we are doomed to discover the awful truth. I sincerely envy the happy ones who never find it. Dear Relativity, I regret to announce you that the people you see on TV cannot move your furniture. Sadly, this is the awful truth. The time that you happily shake hands with really interacts only with your calculations. We do not understand what energy is. We only perceive and measure its manifestations. Even if we understand more about matter, because we are able to perceive it more directly, at the end of the day, we say that matter is essentially made of energy. This is what we really know, and we don't like it. And we feel the urge to pretend that we know more than we actually do. It's basic human behavior. Our virtual image that tries to reflect energy, motion, onto our minds is centered around our calculation of time. Time, as a mental kinetic operator, is crucial for our virtual model of energy. It definitely works as real in our minds. Without it, we simply cannot adapt, survive. The same as your personal computer cannot work without an operating system. Yet the nature surrounding the computer is in no way influenced by the operating system within the computer. Calculating the ratio between different speeds is essential. For us only. The ratio between speeds is certainly real intrinsic in nature, ready to be measured and calculated, as it is a landscape ready to be filmed. This is because the motion is physically real. But the calculation itself is only a picture of it. Maybe that if you move the camera while filming, the landscape will appear to be distorted in your movie. Maybe the trees will appear shorter in your movie, and the rivers will appear flowing slower than they do in the physical reality. Does anyone believe, because the movie is distorted, that the landscape itself gets distorted? Because the camera was moving? What would be the logical base of this assumption? Based on what? Well, actually somebody does. Relativity says that if the camera is moving relative to the landscape at the speed v, the trees will physically contract and the rivers will flow slower by gamma. Based on what? Based on absolutely nothing logical or measurable. Because relativity dilutes so. And this will happen because the time spirit will dilate its muscle and physically interact with nature. Obviously, relativity doesn't even try to explain the presumed physical mechanism of how could time, an entity that it always invokes but never defines, is supposed to interact with nature. How, why, the magic actually works. Time acts like the spirit of fantasy. The only way to change a speed is by acting with a force, except for relativity. No force is predicted, assumed, observed, or calculated to appear between two objects traveling at constant speed relative to each other. There is simply no physical base for such assumption. And the fundamental logic to support its fantasy is nobody can actually check the assumed distortions because of technical reasons. Neither can relativity, but it speaks as if it could. Well, that is not entirely true. The Sagnac experiment proves that the speed of light adds like any ordinary speed to the speed of the disk. But that's supposed to be because the circle is not straight. So what? How does it work? What is the physics in it that makes the actual difference? What makes the straight work and the curved stop? And because relativity rolls the results copy-paste from the ether theory through a dummy mathematical identity presented as if it is an equation. Tennis ball on the wall. Watch the video dedicated to it. The ether theory gives the right result, so that's the reason why you consider it to be wrong. The real, original, special relativity predicts a wrong result before the fixing. C plus V equals C, and that's what proves it to be right. The ether theory had proven its validity on the circular path, where the speeds were actually measured. The almighty relativity still holds only on straight lines, based on the fact that nobody can actually measure the speed of light in one direction. When you measure the speed of light in two directions, you calculate C plus V plus C minus V divided by 2, you get C, regardless if C plus V equals C minus V equals C or not. It's obvious that if you add and subtract the same V, as the ether theory states, you end up with the average value, C, on a two-way path, back and forth. The Haffele-Keating experiment finds both contraction and dilation of time during flight. Gamma, G, is doomed by its formula to be bigger than 1. The time measured in the plane flying at speed v is calculated to be time plane equals g time Earth. This means the time measured by the plane is bigger than the time measured on Earth. Always bigger, as the opposite of smaller. In the Haffele-Keating experiment, it was actually measured time Earth bigger than the time plane. on the east to west direction of flight, precisely upside down of what relativity calculates. Contraction is precisely the opposite of dilation, except for the relativistic algebra. On this proof that relativity works. Yes, it works after it turns upside down the experimental results. Not on paper, but only in the interpretation. Only a few people know the actual theory, so one can write black and read white. It works. Yet, a distortion in time is indeed measured, be it relativistic or inversely relativistic. But is it really a distortion in time? Who actually measures the time? It is in fact a change in the speed of the clocks that measure the time. The time in the atomic clocks is measured by counting the oscillations of the cesium atoms. It turns out that the cesium atoms oscillate at a higher frequency. Normally, when a clock runs faster, you assume that is something wrong with the clock, not blame it on the time that it doesn't actually measure. So, relativity works. Upside down, yet inverted. What else is there but relativity? That is the price physics has to pay for allowing this absurdity to thrive for so long. Well, what if the traveling cesium atoms interact with the medium they traveled through? And that's precisely what the ether theory would say if it wouldn't be gagged by the relativistical propaganda. The muons are measured to decay slower at high speeds. This may be the last stronghold for relativity. What else could it be? Why even try to think that muons are charged particles? Why would anyone think that charged particles traveling at a certain speed induce a magnetic field that is proportional to their speed? As long as relativity in empty space is all that we can see, the possibility that the muons interact with the ether when traveling through the ether and induce the magnetic field in the result is not even considered to be an option. After all, the electromagnetic induction is a relativistic effect, and that's why we understand nothing about how it works. Yet, this insignificant detail is more than compensated by the deep knowledge that flows through our veins in what concerns gravity. At least now we know that gravity is only an illusion, not a real force. It's only a matter of time until we shall all levitate pervaded by this wisdom. The fact that the electrons travel through the electric wires at the speed of snails is yet another strong argument that relativity is the explanation for the magnetic induction. In fact, that the trained athletic snails run faster than electrons. In this perspective, I will contribute to the glory of relativity by proposing the speed of grass to be regarded as relativistic. Well, after 115 years of deriving equations based on how the spirit of fantasy moves the furniture, it's only normal that the modern physics is now turned into a contradictory conundrum, unable to produce a reasonably predictable model of how nature works. The spirit of fantasy lurks all around through its equations and predictions.